Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Brian Hansen. I'm Vice President for Studies here at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and I want to welcome you all to this very special evening. It's our great pleasure to welcome Congressman John Delaney, who's a former U.S. representative from the state of Maryland and also a 2020 presidential candidate. And this program is part of our America 2020 series. The 2020 election, the Midwest is likely to play a very important role in determining the outcome of the election. And what we at the Council want to do is make sure that we provide balanced views on economic, political, and global factors that are important to America and that the public needs to be aware of in this election. So in the lead up to this election, we are bringing candidates, we are bringing experts, we're bringing thought leaders and policymakers to help inform the debate and you all as you engage in this year. Before we get going, a couple of housekeeping remarks. First of all, the Council is an independent and nonpartisan organization, and the views expressed are those of the individuals who express them, and not the institutional views of the Chicago Council. Additionally, as a 501c3 organization, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs does not support or oppose any candidate for political office, and we are prohibited from any political fundraising. So as we get going, I want to invite you to silence your phones, but not your voices. We are live streaming this event, and it is on the record. We welcome your social media engagement. And just to give you a sense of how this will unfold, following Congressman Delaney's remarks, he and I will have a brief conversation on the stage, and then we'll open it up for questions and answers, both from you in the room as well as our online audience. And all questions can be submitted online through Meeting Pulse, which is the online platform that we use. And to do that, all you have to do is take your phone, open up your browser, and type CCGA, Chicago Council on Global Affairs, ccga.live into your browser. Select today's program, and you'll be able to ask questions there. So thank you very much for being here today, and please join me in welcoming Congressman John Delaney.
Well, thank you for that very nice introduction, Brian. It's great to be with everyone here this evening. Thank you for having me at this singular and very important institution. It is such a privilege to be here, and I think it's wonderful that such an amazing resource is available to this terrific city and to the Midwest in general. I have a fond place in my heart for Chicago. I'm not from here. I'm from New Jersey originally. But two of my daughters went to Northwestern, as did my wife. I figured in front of a Chicago crowd, a Northwestern shout-out is always a safe bet. But I really enjoyed all the time I spent coming to Chicago to visit them over the years, 8 straight years. 4 years and 4 years. My third daughter went to Georgetown, so we weren't able to get 3 of them to go to Northwestern. I have a 4th daughter, so we'll see where she ends up. But and prior to running for office, I was in the private sector. And I started 2 companies, took them public, and ran them. And we always had a good-sized Chicago office. And I always enjoyed coming to your city. So it's nice to be back here in this different context. I'm here to talk about a concept in foreign policy that I feel very strongly about, which is how interconnected and interdependent the world has become, which I actually think is a very good thing. And I think the facts clearly favor the optimist in terms of how these interconnections and this interdependence is shaping our world. But it comes with a set of challenges, and the challenges are significant, and they cover a broad range of areas. Obviously, security challenges, climate challenges, public health challenges, a whole range of challenges that come from this global interconnection and interdependence that we've seen unfold over the last several decades. And I think it's something that needs to be talked about in much greater detail as part of our politics, quite frankly. And I think it's very important to every American. I would actually argue that it has never been more important to the average American citizens what happens around the world than today. And that's what I want to direct my remarks this evening towards. So again, I want to thank you again for this opportunity. And this multi-generational push towards globalization has, in fact, in my opinion, been extraordinarily positive. Global integration has improved living standards around the world and here at home. Between 1990 and 2017, global output more than tripled. The developing world has been transformed across this time. In 2015, the world's poverty rate was the lowest in recorded history, with over 1 billion people being lifted out of poverty in the last quarter of a century. Life expectancy has increased 5.5 years around the world from 2000 to 2016, with the greatest increase in Africa, where infant mortality rate during the same period of time has just plummeted. The prevalence of undernourishment decreased in Africa from 28% in 1992 to 20% in 2015, and they estimate it'll be about 14% by 2030. New technologies from smartphones to the expanded availability of HIV treatments have markedly improved people's lives. While countless problems still persist, there has been tremendous progress. In my opinion, the world keeps getting better every single day, which is not something that we hear a lot about in our political discourse. The globalized world that we live in was not inevitable, nor was it accidental. It is the world order that the United States of America and our closest allies set out to build after World War II. In fact, it was our model of alliances that led to its creation. Its foundation was based on a core insight that all countries, big or small, rich or poor, friends and allies or foes, we would benefit from a cooperative, rules-based community of nations focused on open markets, free trade, the rule of law, human rights, and freedom. Since World War II, we've also been committed to maintaining a global military presence, obviously. Our network of bases around the world allows us to project power everywhere and keep the peace. We have a singular portfolio of alliances around the world, including the NATO nations in Europe and Canada, Australia, Israel, key Arab allies, Japan, South Korea, and many others. No nation in the world has anything like what we have in terms of alliances. While news reports highlight conflicts and chaos, in reality, the number of wars and level of violence around the globe has declined dramatically. Both the world and the U.S. have benefited from the global order we have built and led. Similarly, the gravest problems we face right now as a nation and around the world know no borders. Climate change requires a concerted international effort, with a particular focus, in my opinion, on innovation, which I'll touch on. We must continue to lead the effort to eliminate nuclear proliferation, an existential threat to everyone on the planet. To eliminate the threat of nuclear weapons, a concerted, multi-nation diplomatic effort is needed, similar to what President Obama was able to successfully do with the JCPOA. Even with its shortcomings, which were significant, was a very positive step forward. The internet is a borderless network, and it is increasingly subject to attacks from thieves, hackers, and malicious governments residing beyond our shores. Regaining control, including effective data privacy and security rules, while minimizing government interference, requires cooperations with our friends and our rivals. Newer emerging technologies are global from the get-go. Artificial intelligence, bioengineering, facial recognition, quantum computing, the list goes on. These things require common guidelines and standards to avoid abuses, attacks, and to protect users and intellectual property. The list of critical problems that need to be fought at their origin before they spread is very long. It includes human trafficking, drug trafficking, migration and immigration, pandemic outbreaks, and corruption. None of these can be addressed by turning our back on the world. The path forward is a tried and true one, working through institutions and arrangements with confidence and patience, and with a conviction that yes, positive solutions can be crafted. We believe that Russia and China became wealthier and more integrated into the world order. Their expanding middle classes would demand greater social and political freedom, and their governments would be less repressive. Unfortunately, instead, both countries have become increasingly authoritarian, aggressive, and belligerent, and tilt the international system to further their aims. China's military spending is climbing, and its actions and territorial claims in the South China Sea are alarming. China's model of capitalism has become a model for certain regimes that desire prosperity without true freedom. China's well-documented trade abuses, including discriminatory barriers for American companies, limits on market access, massive intellectual property theft and forced technology transfers, subsidies for domestic industries, and policies favoring state-owned enterprises. In short, they've acted like pirates. As the American and Asian economies became more integrated, we lost sight of conditions at home. Jobs left our shores. Manufacturing was shifting from the assembly line. Robotics and automation slashed the needs for workers. The problem was compounded by weakening labor standards here at home. While some of these shifts were inevitable, the U.S. did not effectively advance policies and make investments that would provide the resources needed for industries and communities to evolve as the economy evolved. Nor did we update our safety net. While we were thinking globally, we forgot to invest locally here at home. And it shouldn't be surprising to anyone that the American people therefore questioned everything we had done. For communities, a single plant closing or a labor force reduction has a multiplier effect beyond the workers harmed. I can tell you firsthand, when you go to a town like Newton, Iowa, where the Maytag plant closed about 10 years ago, every single citizen in those towns can tell you the day the plant closed. When you compare that to what you have here in Chicago, where businesses are moving in and out all the time, new businesses are getting started all the time, it doesn't nearly have the impact that it's had in some of these small towns. In light of these challenges and opportunities, what should be our plan going forward? The United States must be better at adapting to this interconnected world and reject isolationist behavior that we have unfortunately seen in both political parties. Isolationism and nationalism, in my opinion, is the wrong answer to any question we could ask ourselves. As president, these are some of the things I would do. First, we must invest in our country. It is hard to lead the world when there is so much to do here at home. Domestic and foreign policy are deeply interrelated. We must improve our education system, including, in my opinion, the creation of a form of universal pre-K, and have it extend through what I call 14, which is either community college or career and technical training as part of basic public education. Pre-K through 14 should be the new K through 12. In many ways, our problem here isn't necessarily jobs, but it's pay. There are plenty of jobs, but increasingly a large number of them have insufficient pay to support a family, which is why I propose a massive expansion of one of the most successful tax programs we have, the Earned Income Tax Credit, which has historically been a bipartisan way to help workers at home. As president, I will ensure that government resources are used to invest in areas that have been left behind by globalization. This means massively investing in infrastructure and in basic researches in life sciences and energy, repurposing Rust Belt manufacturing centers into green energy projects like negative emissions technologies, and embracing trade deals that expand access to foreign markets for our farmers, like the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Second, I think we have to pursue a get-tough approach to China, but not on the backs of hardworking Americans. The president's trade war is proving extremely costly to American businesses and consumers, and particularly to American farmers. And I fear that the president will settle for a short-term Chinese concessions in exchange for surrendering the high ground on intellectual property. The U.S. needs to end trade wars with our allies so we can negotiate with China as a unified front. Again, it also means rejoining the Trans-Pacific Partnership so that we can compete successfully with China in their backyard in the Asia-Pacific region. Third, we must reassure NATO allies of our commitment to Article 5, the alliance and its anti-terrorism mission. NATO is one of the most successful military alliances and has largely kept the peace in North America and Europe. The United States must stand with our allies and show a unified front as Russia continues its effort to weaken NATO and its members. Fourth, we do need to lead the fight against global warming. I will resume U.S. participation in the Paris Climate Agreement, and I pledge that my administration will harness American innovation to save our planet from the effects of climate change. I believe by implementing a carbon fee and dividend program, which I introduced in the Congress on a bipartisan basis, investing in green energy research and unleashing the power of negative emissions technologies, the United States can lead the world in preventing the effects of climate change. Investing in American ingenuity and innovation will not only provide environmental benefits, but will have the added benefits of owning the most valuable technologies in the world. I envision a Paris 2.0 Accord based on innovation, where the wealthy nations in the world contribute capital and intellectual property to building advanced energy solutions, battery, transmission, storage, and negative emissions technologies that can be shared by the global community. Fifth, we must prioritize reviving arms controls negotiations with Russia and pursue them with China. We are at risk of a new global nuclear arms race. I would re-engage with Russia to determine whether the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty is salvageable. The New START Treaty is the last major U.S.-Russian arms control agreement with major limitations and verification procedures. But it expires February 5th, 2021, just days after the next president takes office. It is in our own self-interest to extend the New START Treaty. Six, we need to meet the challenges of cyber warfare. I will propose the creation of a Department of Cybersecurity to bring all U.S. domestic capabilities under one roof and develop a unified strategy to protect the homeland under a single chain of command, while leaving offensive cyber capabilities to the Department of Defense. Seventh, we need to continue to strengthen our military. A report last year from the National Defense Strategy Commission warned that America has reached the point of a full-blown national security crisis. The report warns of decreased air superiority, lagging investments in the next generation of weapon systems, and advances made by Russia and China in particular that threaten the United States' historical, immense comparative advantages. As threats evolve and become technologically advanced, the United States must strategically use our resources. But we also need a strong fiscal condition at home to support it. In general, we must appreciate how globalization's cost can be reduced by our government playing a more assertive role to protect and aid those who are paying a price for the transition to this more integrated world. We must pair fair trade agreements with investments in communities left behind. Expanded trade has driven prosperity around the world. It has contributed mightily to American prosperity and job creation. Rather than turn away from globalization, the overwhelming majority of our citizens, companies, and communities that benefit from a globalized world need to extend a helping hand to our fellow citizens who have been harmed. As I say, we need to think globally, but invest locally. And I think most Americans agree with that. U.S. military and diplomatic global engagements in the 21st century has largely been defined by the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. The lives lost and the casualty from these forever wars are irreplaceable. The cost to our treasury, military, and global standing has been immense. While I support troop reductions in Iraq and Afghanistan, I'm pragmatic about the situation there. There are those promising full troop withdrawal on the campaign trail, but I believe if we do so, we would be leaving the countries without proper resources to counter terrorist activity, which is why we went there in the first place. That is not in our national interest. Our long-term goal should be force reduction, but it must be accompanied by an ongoing presence focused on security and anti-terrorism for the local defense forces. At the same time, we shortchange diplomacy and support for the international system we created. We are not standing up for human rights, freedom, and democracy. You know, we're on the anniversary of the atrocious murder of Jamal Khashoggi, something I believe our government has largely been silent about. We have become increasingly reliant on dispatching our armed forces to solve international problems of every magnitude. Under the current president, the State Department has been starved of resources, a singular asset to the national security of the United States of America. So far in this century, we have had few diplomatic successes. Recent World Trade Organization's negotiations have failed to address today's pressing problems. 3 landmark agreements negotiated by the Obama administration, the Paris Climate Accord, the Iran nuclear deal, and the Trans-Pacific Partnership, involve working with our friends and rivals to achieve a common goal. Were they perfect? Of course not. All have been undone by the current administration, which in my opinion elevates narrow transactional self-interest over this global order. Countering China's predatory behavior, especially concerning trade and other economic issues, first and foremost is a diplomatic and economic policy task. While China is now the second largest economy, our economy is still much larger. The other 8 nations in the top 10 are close historic U.S. allies. The U.S. plus these economies are 3 times the size of China's. Working with these allies is how we fundamentally change behavior with China. Focusing on the diplomatic front, we need to work with these allies to pressure China. The Trans-Pacific Partnership, negotiated by the Obama administration, did exactly this. It placed the U.S. at the head of a table of a 12-nation trading bloc that comprised 40% of the global economy. It is also instructive that the Trans-Pacific Partnership died from multiple wounds. Many Democrats turned their back on President Obama and let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Too few Democrats stood up for the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was President Obama's singular economic initiative in his second term. And those opposed have not explained what a better first step would be. I'm the only candidate running for president on the Democratic side who actually supports the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which in my opinion shows you the depth of this nationalism in our country right now. With workers, industries, and communities not receiving the support and resources needed to adapt to globalization and trade, a steady drumbeat of reports about an aggressive and duplicitous China, malicious actions by Russia, costly wars, and a Trump-led foreign policy disconnected, in my opinion, from our values, it is easy to conclude that support at home and abroad is waning for the international order we built, that the American people are questioning everything. We expected to be leading a world of cooperating nations. We are not. We're now well aware that globalization has its costs, but the benefits, in my opinion, far outweigh the costs. A connected, globalized world is both inevitable and ultimately beneficial. Turning our back on the world takes us in the wrong direction. The United States needs to promote, with all of our tools at our disposal, including economic, diplomatic, and militarily, the open, rules-based international system that we led historically. This means returning to an approach where we work with our friends and our allies. The world is clamoring for U.S. leadership and engagement. Problems that must be solved require us working together with other nations. Engagement must again become our tool of choice to influence global affairs for the better. Experience shows that our best interests are served by working through these institutions. By engaging with other nations, we will never fully get our way, and we need to understand that. Nor does it diminish the need for military power, which will unfortunately always exist. It is hard work, but it represents the best way to advance our nation's interests and those of our allies and our friends in a world where we have the best hand, but we do not hold every single card. None of this is a guarantee of success in the years ahead. We need to marshal our resources and those of our friends and allies, but I would never bet against the United States of America. With the right policies at home and with the right policies from a foreign policy perspective, we can face the future with confidence. In 1958, then Senator John F. Kennedy gave a speech in Baltimore, Maryland, right after Sputnik was launched. And he said we should not seek the Republican answer, we should not seek the Democratic answer, we should seek the right answer. And I think he was right then, and I think those words ring true today. For all of these challenges we have, there is a right way forward. This is a magnificent country. It has every advantage any nation could possibly want to have in the world in 2019. We're just not playing our hand well. And one of the most significant setbacks, in my opinion, has been our withdrawal from global leadership. Because as I said in the beginning, it's never been more important, in my view, what happens around the world today to a U.S. citizen. And the world needs our leadership. The world needs us to work to continue to build this globalized, interconnected, technologically interdependent world that we've seen unfold across the last several decades. It has fundamentally improved the lives of our citizens and citizens around the world. And our historic model since World War II has worked. It hasn't been perfect. We've made some mistakes, mostly here at home. But if we get our act together and start investing in our country again and leading around the world, we can solve all these problems. So thank you for having me, Brian, and I think we're going to have a conversation now, right? Yeah. Thank you.
Have a seat.
Great.
Right there is perfect. Terrific. Well, thank you very much for that talk. Lots to talk about here.
It's a big world.
Bunch on the table, absolutely. I want to start with the issue that you raised about international trade. You draw a strong contrast between yourself and other candidates, and this is a particularly interesting issue. The U.S. did have an approach for a long time. This administration has gone in a very different direction. And one of the things that I want to ask you is, how do you rebuild a coalition that supports trade? Because previously it had been largely Republican supported, with some Democrats coming along in order to push trade deals over the line. You point out you're the only one on the Democratic side who's talking about the importance of trade deals. The president certainly isn't talking that way, nor is his party. Interesting, one little fun fact from the poll that we do every year, 87% of Americans, we found, believe that international trade is good for the United States economy, and 83% good for American companies. Yet the politics of this
are tough.
How do you bring that
so
across the line?
So I think there's two political groups we got to focus on the Democratic side. Because in truth, Republicans were normally in a good spot on this until the president came along. And I think they'll snap right back once he's gone. But on the Democratic side, there's two stakeholders. One, there's huge parts of our country where trade has not been good for them. Because as we all know, trade deals are agreements. You get something, you give something. I think they're positive for the nation in general, but they're not positive for every single person in every single town all the time. So I think I implored the Obama administration, because I was their point person in the House on this, to pair the TPP with an infrastructure program. Because I think if you can go to your communities and say, listen, we're doing these trade deals, but let me actually talk to you about the money we're spending in the community here. That's how you get people to trust you on trade. So I think you really have to pair trade deals with not just retraining programs. They're good, but they're insufficient. Because when the Maytag factory leaves Newton, Iowa, what really that means is someone stopped investing in Newton, Iowa, specifically the Maytag Corporation. So you got to find someone else to invest in that town, or that town's never going to feel good about a trade deal. And there's policies like these opportunity zone policies, which I was the lead on in the House. I think those do that. And then you have to go after the environmental community on this issue, because I think they're just looking at it entirely wrong. I mean, the reason we had fires in the Amazon, remember a month ago we watched in horror, but there's a reason for that. And the reason is because of this trade war with China. Right? China's the largest buyer of soybeans. The United States of America used to be the largest seller of soybeans. That was a very efficient relationship. But now we're not selling soybeans to China. So a bunch of farmers in Brazil said, hey, this is a really big opportunity. We could actually plant soybeans and sell them to China. But there's a problem. There's all these trees in the way. So let's burn them down, clear the land, and plant soybeans. That's why those fires were started. And what I think the environmental community who cares about climate change like I do has to realize is there's a ratio that we all should care about. And the ratio is the amount of trees around the world to the amount of land used for farming. And we want that ratio to be as high as possible. When you have trade agreements, you can make it high because you've created a global order for the efficient production of food and the distribution of food. When you have trade chaos, right, that ratio goes down. And so some of this stuff has to be presented differently, I think.
Okay, one of the areas...
I know that's a little out of left field, but I really believe that's how we got to start talking about this stuff.
No, one of the things that's striking about your talk, in contrast to much of the political debate, is the level of nuance that you introduce into issues. And let me take that and follow the trade issue into China. The Trump administration has pointed to some of the things that you pointed as being problematic. Sure. Theft of intellectual property by the United States, some unfair trade practices. President Trump's approach has been call it out and impose tariffs and try to drive change that way. Is that an effective approach to this? And how would you handle that situation?
I think calling it out, he was right about. So I think his focus on China was more right than wrong. And to some extent, a lot of people in politics were late to this. So I think he was 100% right about shining a spotlight on how big this issue is. Where I think he's been wrong is his diagnosis of the problem and his remedy. So I think he believes the big problem is the trade deficit, which isn't great, but I don't think it's the biggest problem. The biggest problem is the theft of intellectual property. A trade war or an old-fashioned tariff war with us and them directly is how you deal with the trade deficit. And I think there'll ultimately be a deal that's cut where the trade deficit gets better. They'll buy Boeing airplanes, soybeans, these kind of things. But the intellectual property battle has to be waged with our allies and with U.S. private companies, because you need a unified front. And you got to get our companies on board. I mean, a CEO of a U.S. private company cannot bribe a Chinese official to get a contract under the Corrupt Foreign Practices Act. But is it really any different if they put intellectual property into a joint venture knowing it's going to be stolen? In many ways, that's a bribe, particularly with a lot of that intellectual property being developed by U.S. taxpayers. So I just think we need to think about that aspect of it differently. And so I would argue that the only way to deal with China on intellectual property is with our allies and getting U.S. private companies on the same page and presenting a unified front. That'll have its own issues with pain, don't get me wrong. And I don't think tariffs are necessarily always inappropriate. I just think this single-mindedness about who can slap on bigger tariffs is ultimately not going to lead us with the long-term trade resolution that we need with China.
So if you were elected president and you were left with these tariffs in place, what would the move you would be made? Would you?
So the first thing I'd do is get back in the TPP, send a message we're going to compete. And then I'd look at the tariffs and I'd probably selectively roll some of them off to provide relief to like U.S. farmers, for example. And then I would work on other measures with China, with our allies and U.S. private companies to really fundamentally change their policies with respect to opening up their markets, subsidizing their state-owned enterprises, and intellectual property theft, which could come with its own set of pain, don't get me wrong. I think it'll be pain in different sectors.
In terms of the relationship with China, which has some problematic aspects, you've mentioned many of them, there is a growing call, particularly in Washington, D.C., that is characterizing China as a strategic competitor or even a vital threat to the United States. How do you view China? Is it the big kind of existential threat like the Soviet Union was?
No, I don't think that we necessarily have to have a second Cold War with China. Or the first Cold War with China, but another Cold War, this one with China. I don't think that's inevitable. I certainly don't want it, and I don't think China wants it. But I do think we have to be much more clear-eyed about the differences in the threat that China presents. I actually feel pretty confident that if we play our hand right, we can be very successful against China across the long term. because we have certain assets that are ultimately the most valuable assets that they don't have, right? We offer the world a set of values. They offer the world a transactional relationship. As a liberal democracy, we have a huge advantage in intellectual property, because ultimately the great innovators of the world want to work in a place where they have freedom. That's why we have the best universities in the world, because we're the largest liberal democracy in the world. And so ultimately we have a huge advantage with China as it relates to innovation. I also think China's going to go through their own set of pain as their economy changes, and they're going to have to allocate a lot of resources to their citizens the way we did when we built our safety net. And that's going to present headwinds to them. But I think the way you got to beat them is by engaging with our allies. Because working with our allies, I think we have a huge advantage against China. I don't think China is ultimately going to want to evolve in a world where there's two technology operating platforms, because that's where we're potentially headed right now. And I think that's ultimately worse for China than it is for us. So I think we can win this, but we got to play to our strengths.
And what is the source of the leverage then in order to have the Chinese modify their behavior and move in the direction that you'd like to see it go?
It's what I said, the top 10 economies in the world, yep. We're one, they're two, and the other 8 are our allies. Or they were our allies. So we're 3-1 over them. That's the leverage. Mm-hmm. And we have relationships with our allies that go in lots of directions beyond just China. And that's the way we got to play it.
Terrific. And what do we do with that, though? I mean, we can all come together. We agreed basically for the last 20 years that the way we do is, as you pointed out in your talk, we engage economically, hoping that would lead to, or expecting that to lead to internal political change.
Yeah, and it didn't happen.
That didn't.
Right.
You're talking about, trade relationships are good and all. So we come together with our allies, and what do we do?
You got to be tougher. I mean, you basically got to have a different type of trade war, right? Which
Say
is,
more.
What's that?
Say more.
I'm sorry.
A different kind of trade war. Say more about that.
Yeah. Look, because again, if we want to change China's practices around intellectual property, we got to work with our allies, work with our private companies, and if they don't change, we can't do business with them. But it's in it's in the service sector, it's in the technology sector, right? It's not just in the soybean sector. Because to some extent, the deal that China's going to cut with us is going to come at the expense of our allies, ultimately, right? Because I think the president will force them to buy certain things, more of certain things, and they will buy less of those things from our allies.
Okay. So let me, one more China question.
And we can't back off our military presence, by the way.
That's exactly where I was going. China has built its military capability substantially. How do we respond to that?
Well, I think we've got to continue, listen, they're going to continue to do it. I mean, they're no match for us still. I mean, it gets overblown. They're spending a lot of money, because this all comes down to dollars. We've spent a lot more for a long time than they have. They're starting to spend more, but they're still not spending what we are. I think we have to continue to invest in our military. I think our military's got to be, there needs to be some changes in resource allocation. Because I think while we were fighting all these wars in the Middle East, China and Russia were figuring out, well, we can't play that game. We're going to play this next game around cyber, so we need more investment there. But one of the things, I've actually not been negative on the president's efforts in North Korea, because I think you got to have some engagement if you want to have a resolution. But I'm very worried that he might agree to some withdrawal from the Asia-Pacific region in exchange for a deal with North Korea, which I wouldn't agree to. I think we can get a deal with North Korea without having to do that. And I just think we have to maintain our presence in the region. China's going to continue to invest in their military as long as their economy can sustain it. And we have to continue to invest in ours and have our allies. I mean, again, our allies over there are looking for our leadership, right? Because these set of military alliances that we have has been critical to the region.
So let me stay in the region and pick up on the North Korea piece. Some people say, hey, North Korea's got nuclear weapons. Mm-hmm. Who in the right mind would ever give them up once they have them? What should the goal of our policy be toward to North Korea's nuclear weapons? What's realistic, and how do we get there?
Well, I don't think our long-term goals should waver. Our long-term goals should be denuclearization of the peninsula. But I think we have to recognize that progress could be made and 20 steps until that ultimate goal. So, that's kind of how I think we have to think about it. I don't think we should waver from our long-term goal, because that's ultimately in our interest and in the interest of our key allies in the region. But we're not going to get there right away. We know that. So, it all depends what steps you take along the way.
And how big a threat is this? How big a priority should it be in foreign policy to really focus on denuclearizing the peninsula?
I wouldn't say it's the number one issue, but I think it's tied with a bunch of others. I mean, to me, the foreign policy question is, what's your view of the U.S. role in the world, and how do you operate? And then underneath that are all these regional issues that should fit into your larger view of the world and U.S. leadership. So you start by saying we want to re-engage, we want to invest in our military, and we want to re-engage with our alliances, economically and diplomatically. And we want to work through our allies in solving all the problems around the world. And unfortunately, the problems around the world are like that game of whack-a-mole. They're always popping up. But if you have a view as to how you think about the U.S. role, and if you have a view as to how you think about key decisions, engaging military force, et cetera, you apply them to the situation. I think doing things to reduce the nuclear capabilities around the world that's the number one still threat to the world, which is that someone gets their hands on a nuclear weapons and uses it. Not only would that result in a huge loss of human life, but talk about an isolationist world. It would shut everything down. It would shut everything down. The response of all the countries around the world to someone using a nuclear weapon would completely upend this global economic order we have. Markets would crash, countries would become more isolationist, less welcoming of immigrants, everything would change. So I think the number one job of the President of the United States, at least for the foreseeable future, is always working on reducing the amount of nuclear weapons around the world, period, full stop. And so this fits into that, but it's not the only issue. Right. That's how I think about it.
So let me go to another place in the world where nuclear weapons are a big issue, which is Iran. Mm-hmm. The president has put a maximum pressure campaign on Iran, ratcheted up economic sanctions on Iran. You talked about returning to the JCPOA, the quote Iran deal.
But I'd like to improve it.
Okay. And what would you do to make it better?
I voted for the deal, but I thought it was a very weak agreement. And I thought it was a weak agreement in one particular aspect, which was the term was too short. Mm-hmm. It was basically a 10-year agreement, which meant that when the agreement expired, the same cast of characters were going to be running the country. And while we have no guarantee that the next group of leaders in that country will be any better than the current, I would at least like the option for when this agreement expires to potentially have better people running the country. And so that argues for a 20 to 25-year agreement. I thought that was the number one deficiency in the agreement. I thought the agreement as a nuclear agreement was fine. I mean, there's always problems with these things and inspections, and people argue about all that stuff. But in general, I thought that was fine. I would have liked it to have been broader and included ICBMs and, funding of terrorism and all that kind of stuff, but they didn't want that. So my view was, if they do that stuff, we have every right to re-sanction them for all that stuff. But as a nuclear deal, the big flaw with it was it wasn't long enough. But I still didn't think that justified not voting for it. But as president, getting back in it, I think there's an opportunity to strengthen the deal. So that would be my fundamental approach to Iran: get back in that deal, but make it a tougher deal.
Do you think that would require or would be useful to reduce some of the sanctions that are currently on Iran in order to open up a pathway to negotiation?
I think you can go back. I really believe you can get the deal you had before with a longer term, because I think the last several years have been so destabilizing for everyone. There'll be a strong desire to get back.
All right. So I want to go to another place that you have placed an emphasis on, which is on cybersecurity. Mm-hmm. And again, in the Chicago Council 2019 poll, it was interesting. 77% of Americans say that cyber threats are a critical threat to the United States that's higher than international terrorism, or quite frankly, the two things we were just talking about, the nuclear programs of Iran or North Korea.
Right.
You talked about a cabinet level organization that you want to set up. What would it do and how would it help address this?
So if you break our cyber capabilities into two categories, offensive and defensive, I'd leave offensive with the Department of Defense because it's part of their portfolio of how they engage around the world. So that stays with them. So this would be for defensive capabilities. I'd create a cabinet level position, in part because I think it creates the kind of focus on this issue that it deserves. I don't think this issue is going away. We created a Department of Homeland Security after 9/11 because we viewed that this was an enduring threat. And I think cybersecurity is an enduring threat. And I think unless you actually have a cabinet level position, you're not actually creating the framework for this to start being dealt with in an organized way. When I was in Congress, there was a hack by the Chinese on the Office of Personnel Management. And I represented the 5th largest number of federal workers in the country. And all of their records were compromised, both current workers and retirees. And so I started looking at how the US government actually deals with its own cybersecurity. And it was appalling. I mean, it was what you'd expect from any large, massive bureaucratic enterprise, which the US government is. Mm-hmm. I mean, all kinds of different capabilities depending upon where you worked and all this kind of stuff. So there wasn't even a common platform in the US government. There was no best practices in the US government. And there's no best practices that the US government is coordinating right now between the private sector and the government. So I just think if you had a cabinet position, you'd have the opportunity. It's not going to happen overnight, but you have the opportunity and the focus and the attention. And as president, you'd ensure that that position was always getting cabinet level attention. You'd have an opportunity to move to a world where private sector and government sector cyber defensive capabilities are better coordinated and we use more best practices.
Okay, cool. I want to bring you into the room as well, and I'm going to start to ask questions off the list that is coming in online. One question is, and you talked about reducing force levels but staying. And the questioner said, when we left Vietnam and allowed them to sort things out, now we have good relations with them. So why shouldn't we go down that path as opposed to a long-term commitment to force there?
Yeah, so I think the way I look at this, and it's a good question, and quite frankly, it's a very hard question to answer specifically because we don't know what the future entails. My goal would be to get all our forces out of Afghanistan. We have 14,000 there now. My goal would be get it to 0. I just don't think you can sit here today and give a date for that. And that's really where I push back. Because it seems to me with the situation with the Taliban on the ground there, and if you think about the reason we went there in the first place, which was terrorism, and if you think about the enormous sacrifice of human life and investment we've made in that country, that having a more measured, pragmatic approach where we just grind down our forces over time without a specific deadline just strikes me as the more responsible way to address the situation. And it's not a good answer because I'm not saying exactly when I'll get all the troops out, even though that's my goal. But I just don't think you get the troops out faster by saying when you're going to get them out in a weird way.
Got it. Let me look, and there's a question up here, but I don't see a microphone, so I'll have to just read off the list. I apologize for that. One of the people asks, and it comes from the room, is in this room, you are most likely preaching to the choir, people who are in favor of global engagement.
That's why I wanted to come here.
Well, that's good. So how do you convince the citizens who are not agreeing with this agenda, who have been attracted by a more nationalist and isolation approach?
Again, I think I understand why the American people feel this way. There's 40% of our citizens can't afford their basic necessities, which is their housing, their utilities, or their food. 50% of the American people can't afford a surprise $500 expense. And if you go around small towns in this country, you see how they've been hollowed out. And last year, 80% of the venture capital in the United States of America was invested in 50 counties out of 3,000. So there's enormous concentration of opportunity in a relatively small number of places in this country right now. And huge parts of our country have been left behind. So their perspective is basically, what the heck have you all been doing for the last 20 years, 30 years? It's obviously been bad, because look what's happened to my community. And that includes all this money you've spent around the world. And so their response is completely logical. I think what you have to do is you got to make the case as to why it's good for them. But what you also got to do is you got to lead with what you're going to do. That's why I said I implored the Obama administration when they were bringing up TPP. I said, listen, pair this with an infrastructure plan. The Republicans will vote for it because they so wanted the TPP. This was before Trump.
Right.
And the Democrats who are representing a lot of these communities, you got to give them something tangible. Not the theoretical benefits of globalization. Theoretically, what globalization does, not theoretically, what globalization really does is make our country wealthier. And some of that money's got to flow back to these communities. Because otherwise they're not going to see it as a fair trade. And I don't blame them.
So it's interesting, again,
I would never do a trade deal without a massive domestic economic program paired with it. Full stop. And it's not retraining.
Right.
Not that I'm against the retraining, but it's got to be more than that.
Right. Another part of the world, another set of issues. Russia is increasingly aggressive in the world, putting pressure on folks around the borders. You talked about both renegotiating or extending the New START, the arms agreement with Russia, and what else do we need to do to manage that relationship and to hold Russia in check?
Well, look, I think we need a reset of the relationship in some extent because the Russian relationship has gotten so entirely tied up with partisan politics in the United States of America. And that's dangerous because the Russian relationship should be a bipartisan issue, right? We have real threats with Russia, but we also have opportunities of cooperation. So there's got to be kind of a reset. We got to be very clear-eyed about what Putin's agendas are, what his political pressures internally are in his country, which animates why he does certain things, what his worldview is, and what he's going to continue to try to do, which is why we got to support NATO, which, by the way, was our idea, right? We have to recommit to NATO. I'd love for those countries to pay more into NATO, absolutely, but we should be unwavering about our support for NATO. We've got to make sure we've got the offensive and defensive cyber capabilities. Putin's got to understand that we'll have a zero tolerance policy if he gets caught interfering in our elections, which including putting a whole nother level of financial sanctions on the table, like barring a lot of their operators from the U.S. financial system, which is in many ways a death penalty. And he has called an act of war in the past. But we also got to work with Russia. Right? We're not going to reduce, as I said before, the number one job of the president, it seems to me, from a foreign policy perspective, is to get the number of nuclear weapons down around the world. We're not going to do that unless we work with Russia. So we can't have a new Cold War approach to Russia, which is where you hear from some voices in my own party, because of the political interworkings here. So I just think we're going to need a reset that's based on a clear-eyed understanding of what we're dealing with. No excessive optimism about changes there, but also recognizes that we actually have things that we have to work with them and have a common interest. And to the extent we can do those things and they're beneficial for each country, it creates the opportunity for more and more collaboration over time.
Terrific. Another part of the world that is important and in the news quite often is immigration and people coming from particularly Central America.
Right.
What is the approach that you would take to that challenge?
Well, so what I would do, so my wife and I went down to the border in January, and we funded a trip for 14 law students and 2 law professors from Georgetown to go to a facility in Dilley, Texas, which is the largest detention facility in the United States of America. There were 1,700 women and children there when we went. And we basically plugged into a legal clinic for a week to help these asylum seekers make their case. And so I actually sat there and listened to why all these people were seeking asylum. And there's a common theme, and the common theme is there's no rule of law in these countries. The gangs and the police are in bed together. They threaten families, they kill family members, they go to the police, there's no recourse. So ultimately what we have to do is rebuild some semblance of law enforcement and a judicial system in those countries. That is in our self-interest. We're not going to solve all the problems in those countries, but I think we can solve that problem. So I've proposed something called Plan Central America, which was modeled after Plan Colombia, which you may be familiar with, which was successful in the 90s, dealing with similar issues in Colombia. And so one of the things I've called for is, as president, I'll convene a summit of all the interested countries, which are the North, South American countries and even European countries, about how we kick off a program like that, working through NGOs in those countries. It's going to be hard. It's not going to be smooth sailing. It's going to have some collateral issues associated with it. But we ultimately have to do that if we want to prevent the migration at our southern border.
Very good. I want to ask about getting to this issue of priorities. In the first 100 days, it'd be very busy, number of things. Would there be a foreign policy priority for you on your 100-day list? And if so, what would it be?
Well, so there'd be what I just talked about with Central America. There'd be obviously a lot of work with our allies. There'd be getting back in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Trade Promotion Authority was given to President Obama. President Trump still has it, and it expires 20 days after the new president is sworn into office. So I'd want to try to get the TPP done too. So I think the TPP, launching this Plant Central America, and then just work with our allies around the world in reestablishing, telling them that we're back, and we want to start working again the way we used to, with a new set of challenges in a world that's changed. We have to adapt. You can't just apply the same approach because technology has changed everything. But, start focusing on Iran and the issues that have to be dealt with.
Very good, very good. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time for this conversation, but I want you all to please join me in thanking Congressman Delaney, our presidential candidate. And thank you all for coming here. Very good.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Enjoyed that.
That was fun.
Good conversation.
That was fun. It was. That's good.